You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to Tea Break Time Travel, where every month we look at a different archaeological object and take you on a journey into their past. Hello, and welcome to episode 23 of Tea Break Time Travel. I am your host, Matilda Siebrecht, and today I am savouring a delicious apple cinnamon rooibos tea, which just... even though I know it's spring, it tastes like autumn in a cup, which is just wonderful. And joining me on my tea break today is osteoarchaeologist, forensic anthropologist, and object conservator, Jessica van Dam. Welcome, Jessica. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
And what are you drinking today?
I'm drinking Yorkshire's toast and jam tea, which is very delightful.
Wait, what?
Yes. Yorkshire makes a toast and jam tea, and they also make a
toast and jam tea?
And a biscuit tea. Yeah.
That sounds very cool. I must say, so full disclosure to those of people listening, Jess and I are friends. We have known each other quite a while now. We did our masters together at Leiden University, and Jess bought me a tea a couple of years ago, which was the most delicious tea I have ever drunk in my life, and I have been searching for the equivalent since finishing the bag, because when I finished it, I messaged her to say, by the way, if you wouldn't mind ordering me another bag, and we found out that they'd gone out of business or they'd stopped production or something, so we couldn't find it again. So I've been looking for the same tea for a long, long time. It was something like caramelized almond.
That when I worked at the coffee shop and I brought you... Yeah, there was like an almond one, and then there was like a pistachio one.
Yeah, it was from your
Yes, and I have no idea where they sourced that tea.
It was with almond. I remember it was with almond, and it was just so delicious. And I've now just been searching for that same tea.
Maybe I'll email them.
Yeah, no. So
they changed like business names too.
If anyone who's listening in happens to have, that's even worse. But if anyone listening in happens to know of, like wonderful caramelized almond tea that they think that I would enjoy, please do feel free to send me something. I'll always be welcome. So yes, anyway, thank you very much, Jess, for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
First question though. So osteoarchaeology and forensic anthropology was when I knew you. That was what you were sort of focused on at that point. But since then you have developed further, gone in a slightly different side quest, shall we say, which has now become the main quest. And you are now an object conservator. Which my question is, what exactly is an object conservator?
Well, so sometimes we're called art conservators, not to be confused with like environmental conservators. I don't deal with nature. What I do is I fix and clean and care for museum objects, or typically museum objects, but really just anything old that needs help.
Okay. So it is quite often art pieces or sort of, in that respect, but it can also be other things.
Yeah. So like right now I'm working on a dollhouse from Japan from about the 1920s. And then coming up, I'm working on, I think, some taxidermy, which I'm not excited about. But there's just so much arsenic in taxidermy.
Oh, gosh.
And then, just so pretty much anything. So even things you don't think of as objects.
Okay. I was about to say animal, like stuffed animals, but yeah, I guess they are objects in a way. So that makes sense. Well, good to know. Now we're aware of what we're talking about. But so, of course, still working with sort of museum objects, with objects from the past. And even though I guess your background was more in kind of anthropology and the sort of scientific side of archaeology, what sort of got you first interested in that side of things? What first got you into the more historic or the heritage or however you want to call it side of science and conservation? I
think, I can't remember how old I was, but I had these like kids books that had like, it was about some topic. And then they had like the sort of normal pages, but then there was like see-through pages. And there was one specifically on ancient Egypt. And so then it was like layers of mummies that you could like add on with the clear pages. And so ever since then, like the Egyptology childhood, like fever hit and then just never went away. So originally I was going to be an Egyptologist, and then I kind of pivoted, but have always sort of circled back in interesting ways.
Yeah. So actually I'm curious about that. So what made you change direction from Egyptology? There
was a TV show Bones on when I was in, high school. So like when I was a teenager, like pre-college, like pre-undergrad, and I was like, oh, forensic anthropology, that looks like a cool job. And because I had friends in Egyptology who made very little money, I was like, oh, I should pick a more marketable skill, forensic anthropology, which is maybe not the most marketable skill either, but you know, you do what you can.
Although I guess it does have more applications than, for example, something like just anthropology or archaeology, because you use, I don't know, when I think of forensic anthropology, I think of like indeed crime scene investigation and that kind of thing. So is it applicable in multiple different spheres?
Yeah, a little bit. So it's used so you kind of have to know some archaeology to be a forensic anthropologist, because mostly you're working with skeletal remains and often they are buried. And so you have to know how to like properly excavate and document. And
got it. Okay.
Yeah. But then because it's a forensic context, you almost have to be like more detail oriented in case there's like some crucial piece of evidence as you're excavating. And it's not just like, ooh, a potsherd. You know?
Yeah, let's do the context of this. Which, oh gosh, then that's indeed the whole next level. Because to be honest, that's what as I've discussed on this podcast previously, I am not a field mouse. I'm a lab rat, so I will more happily do little investigations in the lab than I will necessarily out in the field. But one of the things that I both loved and hated about academic excavations was that kind of real, attention to detail, let's say, like of having to really, you find something and you have to monitor every single aspect. But so does that mean that you have field archaeological experience as well?
I don't, no. I too am an indoor critter. So the problem with forensic anthropology is like, yes, you could be out excavating the skeleton, but most of the time you're in a lab in the dark, running the same measurements and tests on skeletons like over and over and over and over and over again. And it's definitely a publish or perish field as well, which I do not subscribe to. I don't like it. I don't want a part of it. So
fair enough.
Yeah.
That's very noble of you, I think, to actually stick by those morals. Very, very good of you.
Or just run the other way.
Well, I mean, there's two ways of approaching the same thing. And so is that why, so we started with Egyptology, moved into kind of forensic anthropology, osteoarchaeology, and then now have moved to kind of object conservation. So how did that change come around?
So when I was in my undergrad with forensic anthropology, I interned at the Giza project at Harvard, which was basically creating this database of all excavation records from Giza in Egypt, and which was very cool. And they did a 3D rendering. So if you Google the Giza project, you can take a 3D tour of Giza, which is very cool. So check that out. And then, it's fun. So through that, I met my friend Molly, and Molly had interned with Mimi, and Mimi is an art conservator or an object conservator who specializes, ironically, in Egyptian mummies. And so,
hey, full circle.
Molly was like, oh, you should meet Mimi. And then my mom's friend who worked at Harvard was like, oh, I have this friend Mimi. You would really like her. I think you should go intern with her. And I was like, who's this Mimi woman?
The universe is telling me something.
What's happening? And it took me forever to finally just like, okay, I'll email her. I don't know what I'm asked. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I'm just like, hi, I've heard you're cool. Like, can I come intern?
People keep telling me to contact you. I'm doing it.
And then she never emailed me back. And so it was like weeks. I was like, oh man, she hates me already. Like, this is done. And so I told my mom's friend, and she was like, oh, I'll call her. So she called her, and it turns out Mimi's mother-in-law had died. And so she was like literally at a funeral. And I was like, oh my God, no, like, please don't. Like, I can wait.
Oh,
like, I'm
no.
good.
Yeah.
But eventually I did go intern with her, and then the museum was opening up a new wing. And so then I got a job because payment is nice. And then
it is nice. Yeah.
Yeah. When the pandemic hit, it was like, oh, I can't work and I should go get a degree. So I went and got another degree. So that's how I got into objects conservation.
Got it. Oh, nice. But no, well, which is really interesting to see. It's so fascinating how many of my guests that I have on as well almost sort of have fallen by accident in a way into their final form, if that's a word I can use. Because just through following what you want to do, making contacts with people who are suggested to you. I mean, it's amazing how life works that way.
Yeah. It's always like a weird evolution of like networking and somebody knows somebody who knows somebody who maybe is interesting.
But and following up on those, because like you say, at first you were like, oh no, I don't want to. But then, I mean, thank goodness you did, because otherwise, you wouldn't have got to where you are today, I guess.
I'd still be a barista. So,
which then maybe you could have finally found that tea for me. So, actually,
true.
That's,
true. I mean,
in the long run, what's the best outcome?
Now I need to get into like detecting, like private detective, like find the tea.
Yes, there you go. And you can do the forensic anthropology that you need to do when you have it, and you can conserve any clues that are left along the way. I mean, you're the full package, really.
Yes. Here we go. We're going to find this tea for you.
Next cozy adventure mystery coming up.
Oh my God. Oh, you can write it. Perfect.
I will. Maybe I kind of want to now. Anyway, so we've talked about the tea, we've talked about your experience, but of course the other part of today is the time travel, which I have to ask all of my guests if you could travel back in time. And I think based on what we've just talked about, I can probably guess where you might go, but let's ask anyway, just in case. So if you could travel back in time, where would you go and why?
Okay. This is really tough for me because there are several eras that I would like to go back to. Okay. So like ancient Egypt is cool, but secretly I really like the 1880s turn of the century Egyptology craze. Oh, I recognize that the archaeology at the time was not ideal. And the politics of the time were not great. But there's something about Victorian Egyptology that just seems like, I don't know, fun. I mean, this could be very much influenced by the books that I read, but yeah, so I might do that. I might choose that.
You could do almost a contextual tour. So you could first go back to actual ancient Egypt, and then you can see how it was kind of interpreted and crazed in the late 1800s.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good idea. Okay. If I can go back to multiple times, then great. That's awesome. I didn't know if I was limited to one trip or multiple trips or...
That would be the question. It would be a thing of budget, if you could afford to have the duplex package, then you could go to multiple places.
Yeah, perfect.
Well, then it's sorted. So thank you for joining me on my tea break today. Before we discuss today's object, though, we are first going to journey back to ancient Egypt, indeed, about 4,000 years. It's the middle of the day. It's baking hot out in the open, but luckily we happen to be inside, within the cool stone walls of a dimly lit room. A smell similar to that of pine, almost but not quite, obscures the slightly putrid smell emitting from a corpse that is lying on a table in the center of the room. I say corpse, really? It's more of a shell at this point, as two figures bustle around it, speaking to each other in low murmurs and preparing bundles of straw and an assortment of pots from which waft the pine scent. On another bench nearby are piled rolls and folds of thin, sharp material, pale and clean and fresh. Of course, over the next thousands of years, this fresh material will yellow and shrink, becoming an essential part of our visualization of this ancient culture. So indeed, today we are looking at mummies, which I'm very excited about. And before we go to our break, I do have to ask one final question about your experience. Oh my, I don't know if you can hear the rain. It's really downpouring out there.
I can't.
Well, it'll be a nice aesthetic background. Okay. Good. So yes, I have an essential question about your, academic experience in terms of Egyptology and how you deal with the mummies at your current job. Have you seen and are you a fan of the film The Mummy?
Oh, you mean the 1999 classic starring Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz?
I do mean the 1999 classic starring Brendan Fraser.
What? Me? Obsessed with that movie from my childhood? Absolutely. Interestingly, as we're recording this, next week is the 25th anniversary of its original release. And it's showing again in theaters. And yes, my boyfriend and I are going, and I did get us matching t-shirts. So I am very excited.
I really wish I could go and see it in the cinema, but I don't think they're doing that here. And even if they did, they double the films in Germany. So it would probably be double in German.
Well, this is just your excuse to come here next week. Just
There you go. Yeah. Easy. Just there we go.
Yeah,
it's
fine.
not like I have a job or kids or no money or anything like that. Oh, we'll have an amazing time. I'm sure it'll be incredible. Well, I'm very, very jealous. I'm sure you'll have an amazing time. But for now, let us have a quick pause while we consider the wonder that is indeed Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz in the 1999 classic, The Mummy. And we will be right back soon. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you managed to, get to the tomb in time and save Evie from the hands of the mummy. I've forgotten actually what his name is. The mummy in the Mummy.
Imhotep?
Imhotep, that's the one. Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Honestly, I just really need to rewatch that film.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, so
everybody, go rewatch that film. It's your homework.
we should. So something that I usually like to do to get a sort of vague idea of what those listening might want to know about the topic of the podcast is to look at the most asked questions on the internet, courtesy of Google search autofill, to let us see, what other people are wanting to find out. And seeing as we have Jess here with us today, hopefully we might get some answers about that.
Oh, Matilda, before we get too far, I should clarify that I am not an Egyptologist. I am a fairly well-informed enthusiast, but if any of your listeners today are in fact professional Egyptologists and I get anything wrong or you disagree with my personal opinions, please be very kind. So yes. Anyway, so after that disclaimer, what has Google asked us today?
Well, there were sort of all sorts of, there were some which I thought, this is a little bit weird to ask, but some of them I thought, okay, this is very weird, but actually is quite interesting. So for example, what did mummies look like fresh?
So which layer?
I mean, I imagine they were just a dead body at the
originally it's a body. And then some of the internal organs are removed. Some kept and saved, some sort of just discarded, like the brain's just discarded. And then the whole body is packed in natron, which is a type of salt. Yeah. So then all of the moisture is sucked out of the body. So then it's just sort of a dry body, think leather.
Okay.
And then everything's sort of packed back in and made to look sort of human shaped and then wrapped in linens in different patterns, which changed over the centuries. And then it was eventually anointed with different like oils and resins and stuff. So I guess the answer is sort of a slightly humiform bundle of linens with resinous oil drizzle on the top.
Okay. And would they have been, so in my little, flash bag, I had the linen as being just sort of white and clean, because I guess that's our impression of what it would have been like. But is that similar to, because I know so many people who, you think of Neolithic or the Stone Age and you just think everyone wore brown all the time. But actually there's so many studies now that show that they were wearing purple and reds and pinks and everything. So would the mummies have been just wrapped in white, or would there have been also different colors?
There were different colors, usually sort of decoratively.
Okay.
So I've seen red and pink, but also sort of the off-white natural linen color. Yeah, the red ones are really interesting. There's only a few, I think, that have been found, but they're sort of crisscrossed and striped with red. I think the British Museum has one, but they're very interesting. Okay. So there are other colors, but as you said, they don't necessarily stay the color that they were. And even the white is now sort of like yellow brown and crumbly. So
yeah, okay. Which, I mean, you mentioned it's sort of crumbly. I mean, is it possible to conserve that, or do you just have to kind of put a protective layer on top?
Yes and no. So it's more like, it's just like very stiff at a certain point, or at least the ones, like the pieces that have like the oils and the resins are very stiff. And so if they flake off, you can kind of tack them back down. We use an adhesive called methyl cellulose typically, which is the active ingredient in hairspray.
Oh,
yeah, it doesn't affect the mummy, and it's basically like a plant cellulose, and so we're not really adding anything like too new to the mummy by like using that adhesive. But then we'll also sometimes wrap a new layer of linen around something that needs a little more support, or something we try to match as close as we can, obviously, to the original linens in that like particular location. But yeah, there's a few ways to kind of keep it all together.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Okay. So, but yeah, you don't ever have the urge to secretly add in like a bright green linen or something like that?
I mean, that would be fun. I have never done that.
Look what I found, guys.
Look, it's magic.
It's the find of the century.
Me in the Victorian era. Look, guys, it's great.
Yes. So another question is, it seems quite simple, but actually maybe it's not. What mummies were found in the pyramids?
Well, so there are different pyramids, obviously. Well, maybe not obviously. So there's the Giza ones. Those are the most famous. And that's what we always think of. But there's pyramids up and down the Nile. Typically, they're from around the 4th dynasty, which is about 2600 BCE.
Okay.
Yeah, about then. But also mummification started about at the same time, which means it was not particularly they hadn't really gotten into their stride in the mummification process.
Right.
So we don't have very many like early mummies from that period. And so even mummies that have been found in pyramids are not necessarily the original inhabitants of the pyramids. Some people think that they like got like reinterred there because they were like, oh, it's a pyramid. We should just put him in there. That'll be fun. Okay. We don't have to dig him a tomb. Yeah. So
hey, someone built this already for us. Nice.
Yeah, look. We don't have to put the money in. So yeah, mummification really was like at its peak during about the 18th and 20th dynasty. And so the short answer is there have been mummies found in the pyramids. Who they originally were is unclear. So they're not necessarily like a pharaoh. They could have just been a priest or some wealthy widow or something. And by the 18th and 20th dynasty, they had decided that pyramids were a little ostentatious and so had moved to like rock cut tombs.
Weird that they'd think that.
What? Here is all these gold pieces of this royal burial. Please come and take them. Yeah.
Okay. Have you seen that meme, which is like, oh, you may have competition in life, but we are all buried the same way or something. And then you have a picture of a pyramid being like, speak for yourself, peasant. Okay. So there were mummies found in pyramids, but might not necessarily have been intended for the pyramids and might have been put in there later.
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
Interesting. Oh, that's so fascinating. I didn't know that. So, okay, the next question is actually, you would think quite simple, but actually I don't know the answer to it. So I'm wondering if you do. Why were mummies made?
I did a lot of research for this podcast because I didn't trust my memory.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And so my understanding was always that the continuation of their body and their name guaranteed their existence in the afterlife. Evidently, there has been some research that was not the case. It was more that they were trying to attain like godliness by mummifying. Because they would put like cartonnage, which is sort of almost like a paper mache, but with linen, masks that were like gold and shiny and fun. And it's kind of what we think of as like a mummy face, like not quite the Tutankhamun level gold mask, but the layer beneath that. And so I think that was sort of the idea was that like if they were gold here, then they would be gold and deity-esque in the afterlife.
So it's almost like giving yourself a little makeover, really.
Exactly. Yeah. 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 You're giving yourself Botox before going to the afterlife.
With gold and paper mache.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting form of Botox. Okay. So it wouldn't have necessarily been everyone who got mummified then.
Yeah, I mean, basically you just had to have money. Mummification was very expensive. And so the more money you had, the more likely you were to be mummified and the better quality your mummification was. So like you could pay for like 30 layers of linens instead of like 10, that kind of differentiation.
Be well wrapped instead of just like, this is fine.
Yeah,
they wanted a gold face. Let's just make a paper mache one and we'll stick some eyes on it or something.
Some googly eyes.
Okay, interesting. And so there's sort of a lot of, if you have that idea of it being kind of immortalized, but then we haven't always been able to sort of identify the mummies when they've been found. So, I mean, I guess not all of them have that mask or not all of them have kind of things that would make them easily identifiable, or are there usually some things that you could say, oh yeah, that must be so-and-so?
I mean, it depends on how, like, what the context was. I mean, here we are on an archaeology podcast.
Hey, context is everything, guys.
Often their coffins would have their names on them, and, like, you know, sometimes like a family lineage was included in their names on their coffins. And so if you can tell without too much doubt that the mummy came from that coffin, then that's a pretty clear indication of who that was.
Okay.
But there was a cache found in, I want to say Deir el-Bahri, but I could be very wrong. Please don't be mean. But there was a lot of royal mummies
potentially
found
in Deir el-Bahri.
Yeah. According to Jess's poor memory, but there was a lot of royal mummies that were found in that cache. And I think they know who most of them are. And so they must have had some sort of identifying feature on them. I have not studied that cache or the archaeological records. It was done in the Victorian era. So, you know, good luck, but.
Okay, no, but that's really interesting. And I mean, we talked about the fact that there is still one last question, but I'm going to wait a little bit before we deal with that one because it's quite a big one. So just related to this, so not everyone could necessarily be mummied in terms of humans. And of course, human mummies are the most famous, but am I right in thinking, I mean, there are other kinds of mummies found as well, right? So does that mean that rich people were just paying for like their cats or whatever to get mummified?
I mean, I'm not sure if like rich people were paying for their pets to be mummified, but a lot of like animals were associated with different gods and goddesses. And so they would be mummified in more of a like,
right,
in association with those gods. And so like cats are a big example. They're associated with Bastet and Sekhmet, kind of the same deity that's evolved over a period of time. But other ones are like crocodiles, ibis. I think I've seen dog ones, falcons.
Oh, wow.
So anything that you can kind of like link to the image of one of the Egyptian gods, there's probably a mummy of it. And I think it was more like associated with like the types of temples.
Interesting.
And yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, interesting. No, that's really, really cool. And I mean, also, so far we have been focusing on mummies from Egypt, but I believe that there are mummies in kind of other parts of the world. How did the kind of mummification process differ, and how did the kind of development of mummification kind of differ in different parts of the world?
That's a good question. So there are several regions that have sort of the deliberate mummies, which we think of as Egyptian mummies. So doing something artificial to ensure that the body is in fact mummified. But there's also sort of accidental mummification, which does happen in Egypt because it's very dry.
Oh.
But there's like Peruvian mummies. Those often, I think they're cave burials. Again, this is not my field.
Right. Yes. Like yeah. I think I know the ones you mean. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, yes. And somebody will know. Someone in the comments will know. And then there's Korean mummies have been found because they wrap their bodies in so many layers of silk. They just sort of accidentally mummified. I haven't done a lot of research about them, but they sound fascinating. But yeah, so there's kind of mummies all over and like at different time periods. So
yeah. And so what was the oldest mummy found then? Does that come from Egypt?
I think the oldest deliberately mummified individual was from the Chinchorro culture, which is now Chile. It was from about 50 BCE. And the oldest naturally or like accidentally mummified individual was from the Atacama Desert.
Okay.
From about 7020 BCE.
Okay. So I mean, you mentioned like 5050 BC or something. And I think I remember you saying that the earliest Egyptian one was in like 2000 BC or something. So, I mean, they were doing mummification in other parts of the world a lot earlier actually than in Egypt, even though when we think of mummies, I guess we immediately think of Egypt, which is quite funny.
Yeah. It's kind of happened all over the world and for a very long time. So it's not just the Egyptians, even though they get all the fame, although they have a lot of gold. So, you know, maybe that's what is the driving force of our knowledge.
I mean, yeah. And those masks, the
exactly.
paper mache masks.
Paper mache, yeah.
Yes, true. Where is the money? Right. They have the big pyramids, which
the only seventh wonder of the ancient world. So what's left?
True. That's very true. Yeah. That's very true. Well, so by the way, apologies if you can hear my daughter in the background going blah, 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 blah. It's, I think it's very disrespectful that she hears me talking and just goes blah, 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 blah. It's like, no, I'm saying very interesting and informative educational material here. Anyway.
One day she's going to find this fascinating.
Exactly. Yes. One day she will find it interesting. Yes, exactly. So my final question, which comes from the Google autofill, which I thought was an interesting one, actually. It came up in several different sort of forms, but it all asked basically the same question, which is why should or should not mummies be in museums? So, and I've heard this discussion a lot. Of course, mummies are human remains. So I'm curious if you can maybe shine a light on that discussion and why there's a feeling that maybe mummies shouldn't actually be in museums anymore.
Definitely a contentious question, and definitely dependent on the origin of the mummies. As we've talked about, mummies come from all across the globe, from Peru, Egypt, Korea, even the UK. And while some are deliberately created, like the Egyptian ones, there are some accidental ones like the bog bodies or the ice bodies.
Oh, I was thinking UK, but of course, the bog bodies, yeah.
Yeah, bog bodies. For Egyptian mummies, because their beliefs hinged on the continued existence of their names and bodies, or at least their bodies to make them into divinities, I personally think that we're sort of aiding in their afterlife by caring for, looking at, and talking about them. Obviously, we don't necessarily know all of their names, but I feel like there must be some sort of gray area that's like, well, at least they're being talked about in some capacity.
Oh, that's a really nice idea, actually. I like that.
For other types of human remains on display in museums, it's a tough call. On the one hand, you want sort of the educational aspects, both relating to human anatomy and also different cultural practices around human remains and death. On the other hand, some viewers are just looking for a ghoulish spectacle. And so, they just want to go, ooh,
ew, a mummy.
The mummies are creepy.
Yeah.
Let's go look at the creepy mummy. And while you would like everybody to be respectful, you're not going to get that. You can't force people to be respectful.
Yeah.
There's also the sort of observation I've made, or I think some other people have maybe made this too, but our general culture today is sort of death avoidant. We don't necessarily like talking about death or viewing or witnessing or I don't think any of us particularly want to experience death, but
right. Yes.
or like be death adjacent. But I think it's really important because it was so.
Sorry. It's a very serious topic. It's a very good point you're making, but the phrasing, yes. But anyway, carry on.
Yes. Death adjacent. So I feel like it was so integral to so many cultures of like how they dealt with death and how they prepared for their afterlife and how they prepared their loved ones for afterlife and everything. So I think it's really important that we don't avoid it instinctively just because we don't necessarily like it.
Right. Yeah. Fair enough.
And a lot of people have brought up that, like everything should be returned to the original country that something has come from. So Egyptian mummies are a fairly popular topic for that. A lot of people think that mummies should be brought back to Egypt. For the most part, if the objects were brought legally, which is to say they followed the laws at the time, the Egyptian government is really quite happy with them staying wherever they've ended up, as long as they're appropriately cared for, or at least we hope.
Okay.
Yeah. And unless they're royal, they don't really mind. I mean, obviously we could go into like some like case studies of like the Rosetta Stone or the Bust of Nefertiti and how those should be brought back to Egypt. And there's all sorts of things. Yes, we could fill a whole podcast series about that.
Yeah.
So I don't want to like go too crazy.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I mean, some of my friends have, specifically said that they don't want to see Egyptian mummies in museums because they feel like they should be sent back and it's disrespectful and all this stuff. And so I have mostly told them that if they feel weird about looking at Egyptian mummies, either, don't go, or just treat them with respect and understand that their beliefs differ from ours. And then research until you feel less uncomfortable. Because I think the more that we educate ourselves, the more we can sort of understand how they may have felt as opposed to us. And so we can sort of go from there. So anyway. So it's just a tough question to answer. And it's sort of a personal, there's only like personal answers. Really.
Yeah. It's one of those things. Because like you say, in terms of ethics and things, I guess, indeed, like you say, maybe they would have actually appreciated having them displayed and having them cared for and interacted with in that respect. So, yeah.
Yeah, and obviously we can't ask them. So we kind of just have to guess the best that we can.
Well, we could when we do our time travel trip. We can check and see what they think.
Yes. Yeah.
That sounds like a great idea. Okay, well, we're going to have a very quick break now so that those listening can have an opportunity to top up their tea, but we will be back very, very soon. Welcome back, everyone. I hope the teacups are now fuller and the biscuit jar emptier. So we did already talk a little bit about sort of your directionality and how that kind of all worked in terms of your experience, but maybe we could go into a little more detail now in case anyone who's listening in is going, hey, I'm interested in Egyptology and I thought I was interested in forensic anthropology, but maybe I want to go in a different direction. So, I mean, we've talked about how you kind of changed direction a little bit throughout your career so far. How easy was that direction change to do? I mean, you mentioned that the last one was you had to do the degree because you needed the job and all of those kind of things. But I mean, from a practical or administrative standpoint, how easy was it to change track?
It's always been kind of easy, I guess. I mean, it helped that I picked subjects that had transferable skills. And so it was fairly easy to pivot. But Mimi, who I mentioned earlier, Mimi Levesque, has been particularly helpful because she originally was an archaeologist and did conservation for archaeology. And so I sort of followed her ever so slightly. I just have a little bit more skeletal knowledge, but not by much. She was really good. So so it's just, it's always been sort of transferable and easy to switch over.
Okay. Oh, well, that's good. That's nice to know. So try to go for things that if you would change, you would still have something to kind of fall back on, which is a good way to do it. And so in terms of so obviously you came from sort of a different side of things and luckily you had those transferable skills, but for people who might be listening in who are just starting on their journey, what is the kind of more the normal process, shall we say, of becoming an object conservator? I
mean, if you're really, really at the beginning, then I would say do an undergrad in either art conservation, if that's truly what you want to do, or try to sort of double major if you can in art and science and get as broad an education in those as you can, because that's basically what art conservation is. It's just a combination of art and science because you have to understand chemicals and
nice. The perfect company.
Yeah, exactly. And then, and so then you can go into internships and pre-program internships and you could get a master's, which is what gets you the better jobs. Do post-program internships and fellowships, and hopefully you find a job at some point. And obviously, all of this sort of depends on which country you're looking at and what education system you're in. But there's pretty much options in most countries, I believe, or nearby. I mean, Europe is just sort of nearby at a certain point.
Just across the pond, right? That's the phrase we use.
Exactly. Exactly.
Very, very close. And would you say it's quite a sort of competitive area to get into? I mean, are there, if you get your degree, if you do your internships, or, I mean, can you get internships, or is it already quite competitive at the sort of training level?
The pre-program internships, I think, at least when I was doing mine, which was sort of unofficial, it was fairly easy to get because a lot of places don't list their internship opportunities. You have to go and contact them. So if ever you want to do something, I mean, it doesn't even have to be art conservation or Egyptology or whatever, but like go intern in it because you want to understand what the day-to-day activities are like. Because I didn't understand that I didn't actually like forensic anthropology or archaeology because it was a lot of repetitive tasks that didn't vary that much from day to day. And I got so bored so quickly. But art conservation is different every single day. So I don't get bored typically. But I wouldn't have known that had I not interned in it. So I think whatever you're trying to get into or whatever you're interested in, just go intern in it because they'll just take you. I mean, people will always take cheap or free help. So
True. Yeah, very, very true. And I mean, because you've sort of changed direction so much, do you regret not having originally started with art conservation, or do you find that what you've learned in your previous jobs, I mean, you mentioned transferable skills already, can you use them in your current position as well? Or is it just sort of indirect skills in that way?
In some ways, yes, I do wish that I started in art conservation. It would have been nice to like maybe be farther along in my career at this point, or, you know, maybe I could have more like finely aligned my education to support a really strong base in art conservation. But at the same time, so many of the skills that I learned in my previous degrees are transferable. Like I did a lot of sciences and forensics, which is really important for art conservation. And then my archaeology background has been really helpful in working with Egyptian mummies, which I have worked on, technically only one at this point, but still, anyway, I have worked on them. And it's helpful for like object handling, because if you're used to handling a, 2,000-year-old Anglo-Saxon brooch that has just been excavated, then you can handle a 100-year-old vase. So that's also like a different kind of transferable skill. And I had a background in art when I was younger, so I've always sort of done art. And so I didn't really technically need art courses to bolster that. I think they would have been helpful, but I've sort of avoided needing more education because I don't need more degrees.
Right. Yeah.
I think 3 is enough.
You don't want to, got to catch them all.
Yeah, right? They're like Pokemon. Got to find them.
What will be next? That's the question. Then I got to have you back on again, to go in a different direction.
I already have one friend who has promised to shoot me in the head if I ever decide to do a PhD. So it won't be a PhD, but I could do a 3rd master's. This could be it.
What would you do, out of curiosity, if you would go in a different direction?
I might do something with Korean history. That's another interest that I have, is Korean history and conserving Korean objects. So maybe doing something with that.
That's related though. So that's
it's all tangential. It's all
And in terms of sort of the work that you do now, you were working for a museum, but you also do commission-based work as well. What are the kind of advantages and disadvantages of those 2 jobs?
So if one had a full-time fixed position, which I don't, but if one did, you get regular paychecks, you get, well, especially in America, you get health benefits, paid time off, sick leave, all these like really nice luxuries, because in America, those are luxuries for sure.
Right.
But at the same time, when I work contract jobs where I set how much I'm being paid, I can make a lot more money in a lot less time. So, I mean, the goal for me, I think, is to sort of have both if I can. We'll see how possible that is. But yeah, so it's all just sort of like balancing a regular paycheck versus a big paycheck sometimes.
Yeah, taking that risk. Which, on that note, are there any exciting projects coming up or anything planned for the future?
I mean, being on your podcast is definitely the most exciting project I've been on. Projects, I should say, as I just saw that our first podcast together was released today. So I'm excited about that.
Yes, that's true. On the day of recording, indeed. Yes. Yes, indeed. For those of you who are not aware, I also co-host another podcast called And My Trowel, which looks at the intersection between fantasy fiction and archaeology. And Jess was our guest this month talking about vampires. So if that's something that interests you, please do go and listen to that.
I love the varied topics that you get me on for.
Right? Mummies,
vampires, mummies. I mean, what's going to be next? What supernatural creature shall we find next?
Could do a zombie or something. That's the dead person. You can talk about that as well.
Oh yeah. We could talk about Frankenstein, maybe. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, there you go.
I don't know. We'll find something, I'm sure.
Dorian Gray, art conservation. Anyway, but anyway, interesting projects coming up. Sorry.
Dorian Gray. But yeah, it was in terms of future projects. We had a mummy project fall through. So a few summers ago, I worked on a mummy that is housed in Pennsylvania at a very small college called Westminster. And it was very cool. And so Westminster College social media did post about it. So I'll try to send the link over to you, Matilda, so you can put it in the show notes. It was very fun.
Yes. Yeah.
The mummy's name is Pesed. And so I specifically worked on her coffin while my supervisor, Mimi, worked on the mummy. And we had an intern, Laura, and our Egyptologist, Jonathan. Wow. So we jokingly call ourselves the Mummy Dream Team, which is very fun. And so we're always looking for new mummy jobs, mummy opportunities, but funding is particularly scarce, unsurprisingly. So we're keeping an eye out. But that's the ultimate goal, is to find more mummy projects to do.
Well, excellent. Well, hopefully, people will be listening into this podcast and go, mummies. Yes, I have loads of money and I want people to look at mummies. So I will send her my fund right now.
Here, have a pot of money. Yes, thank you.
Exactly. Perfect. Well, I think that marks the end of our tea break. I'll leave you to your quest for funding for the mummy project. But thank you so much for joining me today, Jess. Very much appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And if anyone wants to find out more about Jess's work or mummies or anything that we've spoken about today, check out the show notes. I'll try and put in as many links to things as possible on the podcast homepage. I hope that you all enjoyed our journey today. If you want to help support both this show and all of the other amazing series, for example, And My Trowel, that form the Archaeology Podcast Network, you can become an APN member. You'll be helping us to create even more amazing content. You'll also, just as an extra bonus, have exclusive access to ad-free episodes and bonus content like our quarterly online seminars, which look at different topics within archaeology. So for more information on that, do check out the homepage at archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Also, if you would like to continue the conversation or ask any questions, you can contact both me and all of the other hosts on the Archaeology Podcast Network through our Discord server. Again, all information is on the website. Bye for now. See you next time. I hope that you enjoyed our journey today. If you did, make sure to like, follow, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and I'll see you next month for another episode of Tea Break Time Travel.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Cultural Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.